So let's zoom out. What did it eat?
I mean, you could go for the classic joke of whatever it wanted, but the reality is, the relatively big herbivores that are around at the time, it's probably largely leaving them alone because, again, just the classic dynamics of predators, even like, quote, super predators like Tyrannosaurus, they're still real animals. If you get injured and you can't hunt, that's probably the end of you. So you don't want to tackle an adult Triceratops that weighs the same as you and has meter and a half long horns on its head and is potentially pretty aggressive. And then even the big, so the hadrosaurs, the kind of classic duck-billed dinosaurs, they're not present with any like obvious defensives. They don't have armor, they don't have horns or spikes or anything like this, but they're simply massive. Again, yes, T-Rex has got the teeth and the bite, and even if they're a bit rubbish, the claws on the hands, but like just grappling another animal which is the same size as it, there's a risk you're going to get a foot trodden on, that it's going to get off some kind of body slam or whatever. And then even if you do bring it down, you're never going to eat it. Like, if you bring down an animal that weighs 5 tons, it's nearly your own mass. You're not going to eat it before it goes rotten. That's a huge amount of kind of, not like wasted energy, but you've probably put a lot of effort into this and you're not getting that much reward out. And again, there are exceptions. You've got things like lynx are the classic one. Lynx are not very big cats, and yet they'll hunt adult deer. Way bigger than them. Lions hunt things like buffalo, but they're operating in a group, so it's a bit of a cheat. So there are some things that do this, but fundamentally, the vast majority of carnivores tackle stuff that's way, way smaller than them. And that's what we see. Every record we have of basically any large carnivorous dinosaur where you have stomach contents where it's like consumed something or healed bite marks, we get quite a few. There's a handful of them where there's an obvious damage to a bone, in more than a couple of cases with a tooth broken off in the bone, and then the bone has healed over it, so it got away. They're juveniles. They're relatively young animals, and that's what they're targeting. It makes ecological sense. It's what modern animals do for very good reason. Juveniles are relatively small and weak. They don't have the horns or frills or armor or shields and other stuff. They're naive. You often have to learn what predators are, or you have to learn how to avoid them, or to check the wind, or even physically see them see them kill something else before you know that they're a threat. And juveniles forage badly. They're relatively inefficient, so actually they need to eat more for their size than an adult does. And then on top of that, they're not very experienced at foraging in the right areas. And even if they can find a good patch, the adults will often beat them up and chase them off.
You're talking about juveniles across various species?
Everything. This is just a universal pattern of being a smaller animal versus a larger, or a younger animal versus a larger animal.
So hunting young
things.
Young things is easier.
Yeah,
because they're dumb.
Right, they're dumb, but they're inexperienced. But they're often feeding in suboptimal areas. So this is the place with all the best food. The adults will kick you off, so now you have to feed somewhere else. Maybe the food isn't as good, in which case you need to eat more of it, so it takes longer. Or maybe it's the one next to the edge of the forest where the T-Rexes hide. But either way, you're stuck there, and then you don't really know what you're looking for, and you haven't got the armor. So guess who's getting eaten? Like, this is, again, there's lots of exceptions. You can't have nature without things like that. But this is the absolute rule of thumb for how foraging and growth and predation operate across everything from fish to fish as predators, starfish, praying mantis, all the way up to things like big cats via stuff like crocodiles. It's how it works. So it'd be very weird if it didn't also operate for dinosaurs. And then, as I say, we've actually got the direct evidence for this from bite marks and stomach contents. They're taking small stuff.
Bite marks give a lot of information.
Yeah.
That's a powerful signal in paleontology.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done really quite a lot of work on it, and they can tell you an awful lot if you've got the right understanding of the burial conditions, because the weird thing that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is you basically can't take fossils at face value, particularly when you're trying to get into stuff like behavior and ecology, because between the animal dying and the paleontologist digging it up, potentially quite a lot has happened. And that's where it's really easy to start misinterpreting things, because if you just go, I had one like this not too long ago where I was an editor on a paper, and the authors had done a pretty good job, to be fair, but it was this discussion of whether or not several animals were together at the time of their death. It had multiple theropods together in this quarry, and it's like, right, but there was loads of debris, and you had loads of things like fish scales and other small bones, and it's like, okay, but this looks like these animals potentially died somewhere else, and then a flood or a river washed them into this bay or a channel, or then the water level dropped and they ended up together. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were together when they died. And so just because you've got 3 animals together, what is potentially the story of how they got there?
So you have to consider multiple explanations and then try to figure out what is the most likely.
Yeah, or what can you test with various bits of evidence? So there was some tyrannosaur inflicted bite marks on a duckbill from Mongolia that I worked on years ago. The specimen was from Mongolia, but it was held in Japan in a Japanese museum. I was working with the Japanese on it. And I'm not a taphonomist, so the study of like decay and the history of specimens, and I am in no way, shape, or form a geologist. I did zoology for my degree. But the guys I was working with, like, they were really hot on erosion and damage. And they were looking at some of the way the bones had been damaged, and they're like, okay, we're pretty confident that the bite marks are sitting on top of erosion.
What does that mean?
So it means that the animal had died, and it was found in sand covered, but in what would have been a river channel. So this animal has died, washed downstream, ended up on a sandbank. The sand is whipping past, because I've been in a sandstorm in China, and it is not fun. And that's starting to etch some of the bones and damage them.
And after that, there's a bite mark?
After that, you're getting bite marks coming in. So that can only be scavenging. That thing has been dead and sitting out for days, possibly weeks, before something came along and chewed on it. Wow. It pretty much can't have happened any other way.
And you have to take these really subtle signals to reconstruct the story.
But then you can start piecing some other stuff together. So in this case, the skeleton is pristine. It's one of the best hadrosaur skeletons out there. It's certainly the best from Mongolia I've ever seen. And all the bite marks are on one bone, the humerus, the upper arm bone. Every mark. We went over the rest of the skeleton, nothing. And then the humerus is chewed to bits. There's bites all over it. But when you look, there's 2 really distinctive patterns. There's deep circular punctures, and remember what the shape of this thing looks like.
Yeah.
At the ends, and then along the delta pectoral crest. Okay, it's much, much bigger in a hadrosaur, but this bit, but remember, that's where all the big muscles attach. There's all of these types of, this is from a different bone, but different animal, but all these types of close parallel scratches. And so that looks like selective feeding, because it's using its giant crunchy teeth at the ends to get the bone off, and this is off a buried skeleton. And then it's got these, actually T-Rex has really small teeth at the front of its mouth, right in the front where our incisors are. They're called incisiform teeth. They look like incisors. They're a fraction of the size of the big ones, and they've got a really weird flat back. And that's what these are. It's hidden this with the front of the mouth and pulling.
And that's mostly for eating.
Yeah, and that's why it's just on the delta pectoral crest, because that's where all the muscles are. So I always liken it to getting something like an Oreo, and you take the top off, and you scrape the cream out with your teeth. I think most people have done that.
Yeah.
Right, but that's what it's doing. So it's got this little row of teeth, and everywhere you get lots of muscle, you get little rows of teeth together.
So there's different bite marks for sort of fighting, killing, and then there's different bite marks for eating.
Yeah, so it kills and dismembers with the big teeth up the side, and then it feeds with the little front teeth.
And all of that has evidence.
Yeah.
In the bones.
Yep.
What hunting strategy does it use? Can we figure that out?
So that comes down to the to that foot stuff. They're relatively efficient compared to a lot of other things, and particularly compared to the herbivores. So that means they're probably looking at long distance rather than speed. And that makes sense, because even though the kind of stuff we're talking about, like I said, maybe they're getting to 20, 25 miles an hour, that's pretty quick, but some of the smaller stuff is going to be a lot faster than that. And remember, that's a real upper estimate. They're probably not that quick. But yeah.
So they're just jogging after you.
Right, but they've got they've got the distance. So yeah, so it's much more hyena or wolf-like strategy than like a cheetah going for hyperspeed or a lion going for a relatively quick burst, and it either gets you or it doesn't. And then the people kind of just go, well, like, but that's ridiculous. Like, they're not even that quick. And it's like, yeah, but if you're hunting something big, that's not that quick either. And so that's a misconception. Like, when I'm talking about juvenile dinosaurs, I don't mean just out of the egg and weigh a kilo. Like, a juvenile triceratops could still weigh a ton and be the size of a rhino. They're not that fast. And again, if you get a head start on them, because as I said, I suspect they're nocturnal. So, because that's the other thing, it's really hard to hide a T-Rex. Even lions and tigers struggle to kind of hide in long grass. When you're 3.5, 4 meters tall, like, you can't hide. Maybe in a forest, but even then, you're probably going to stick out and it's going to be hard to maneuver between the trees. And we've got big tyrannosaurs living in what we know to have been relatively open environments. Maybe there's some stands of trees, but it's not like a woodland or a forest or anything like that. So they're living in the open and surviving in the open. So they've got to have a way of doing this. And I think it's either or some combination of being nocturnal, so it's relatively easy to sneak isn't quite the wrong word, but approach things to cut the distance down for your initial strike and then just running them down. Because, yeah, maybe a 1-ton Triceratops or 1-ton Hadrosaur is rather faster than you. But if you've covered the first couple of 100 meters to get up to your top speed before they start running, then you're probably much closer to them. And then will they exhaust faster than you'll keep going? Well, probably not 100% of the time. No predator's that effective. But I suspect that's what they're doing. And it fits with what we know of their size, their vision. They've got a very good sense of smell. Again, that makes sense at night. It makes less sense if you're diurnal and operating primarily in the day. And you got to hide this thing. And then we know they're pretty efficient versus relatively fast but not that efficient prey.
Well, there's a bit of a debate of scavenger versus hunter.
They're obviously both. A, because we've got things like the bite marks I just described, which is pretty much definitive scavenging. And then we've got the healed bite marks with T-Rex teeth buried in bones, which is pretty much definitive active predation. So we've got evidence of it doing both.
But can we possibly figure out what was the primary strategy?
That gets much harder. My guess is they're probably still primarily actively carnivorous. Because if you look at stuff that's reliant on being a scavenger. I mean, the true scavengers, like the vultures and condors and stuff like this, you have to be ultra long distance, very energy efficient travelers. You know, they're soaring in thermals. They're barely using any energy to fly. It's really hard to get very far.